Hello and welcome back to They Don't Teach This in Law School. I'm your host, Charlie Mann of Law Firm Alchemy, and we are in part 2 of a We're Going to Figure Out How Many Parts series. It might be something we rotate in, bring back, but definitely a multi-part series right up front called All the Firm's a Stage. And for those of you who don't know, I was a theater major in college, an actor in high school, did some semi-professional theater in the DC area, but I also have my very good friend on here, Brian Austin, who has even more theatrical experience than me. He is the interpreter of James Madison in Colonial Williamsburg, has done that for more than a decade, right?
Yep, that's right.
Okay. And we're going to be talking about some of the stuff we teased in the previous episode, which I know for many of you, this is a random departure from what we've discussed. And maybe you hopped in on this and you're like, I don't know what this is about. And you're jumping in on part 2. I encourage you to go back and actually listen to part 1. I've had several people reach out and say like, oh, this was just a really enjoyable discussion that they were able to pull a lot of interesting ideas out of and a lot of ways to relate to being a trial attorney, being the salesperson in the law firm, and different ways to categorize and catalog that experience. And today, so, the question being, what's one thing they don't teach you in law school? Today, we're going to talk about the processing mechanisms of theater as a performer and how that relates on sort of an internal level. Because last time we talked a lot more about external performance. This time it's going to be more about the internal and how you combine things like improv with also sticking to the script, a little bit of the truth behind what performers are sometimes thinking about. And you're going to relate to this as an attorney, I promise you, on that front. But Brian, good to be talking with you again.
It's great to talk to you too. In proper part 2 fashion, I say we leave on a cliffhanger.
Well, now we're going to have to spend the whole time, and actually this is going to take me right into the whole multi-track mind discussion.
One of our main characters might die in this and then come back dressed in white.
I like it. I like it. So, which, for those of you who aren't sure about that, that's Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White, just making sure everyone gets it. By the way, Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, in my top 5 movies of all time, the extended cut in particular.
We're just covering all bases. We're making sure. I'm really excited to be back, Charlie. I've been spending the week thinking about really all the lessons cumulatively that we learned both together and apart, and how it relates, where those similarities are, and how really law firm entrepreneurs and owners can benefit from the experiences you don't usually get. What an odd education that we had, and what wonderful things that we're able to do with it because of its uniqueness. So I'm super excited to pass that along and share that with a wider community.
Yeah, and I think today what we're really going to help people with includes many of the people who listen to this show who have a lot of trial experience will relate to this. It may be a simple 1% refinement of the skill set, tool set, intellectual tools that they already have. For some people, it may be some massive unlocking moments for them, but it also relates a lot to being in the position of selling someone, doing intake, and even something as simple as shooting video, or if you do live seminars. There's a lot of, I hate using the term stuff, but it's such an applicable term. There's just a lot of stuff that goes into that type of both scripted and unscripted performance that I have found tremendously helpful. And it always shocks me, Brian, when I'm talking to law firm owners who, I very intelligent individuals, the vast majority, very, very smart individuals. I mean, they all had to earn their way into that position one way or another, much less being a law firm owner, like what you have had to earn to get there, to make that happen, says a significant amount about that individual. But I always take for granted some of the stuff that you and I have from a performance background. And I would dare to venture that it is slightly harder to learn an open and abundant style of performance and being yourself later in life than it is to learn new intellectual matters. And that can be a difficult And actually, I'm even thinking now, Bryan, of the discussions I have with law firm owners about social media and trying to be themselves on social media, and that there are internal processing mechanisms that tend to hold them back. And part of what we're going to discuss here are filters. Now, you have one of the most exaggerated filters among performers, because part of your responsibility in Colonial Williamsburg is to live a day, live sections of a day as James Madison. And you're out there having to filter through and pass James Madison through to these people through you as the vehicle. I'm curious what that was like for you in the beginning and how you learned to start passing that through yourself.
That's great. I think this gets us into some of the things that we wanted to talk about today. So there's famously this device in theater called the actor's nightmare, right? People have written plays about it. It's a common experience that performers have. If you have any kind of performance experience, or even as you've looked into practicing law, going to trial, standing in a court, you might have had some version of this. Now the actor's nightmare can go a lot of ways, but it usually falls like this: you show up on stage and you realize you don't know your lines.
Yeah.
Or you realize you don't know your blocking. Maybe you're in your underpants. Maybe an old high school bully's in the audience pointing and laughing. It's
real.
some kind of version of you spend so much cognition making sure you are prepared. You have a nightmare where you arrive at the most important situation unprepared for what you need. You don't have the tools that you need. And so when I first got to Williamsburg, naturally, we in high school, we became very disciplined about learning our lines, getting them rote, getting them perfect, knowing our blocking, studying our script. So you kind of arrive at this sense of calm where you're like, it's never going to matter because the lines are going to be given to me. I'm going to learn them. I'm going to know my blocking. I'm not going to have to be in that situation.
Yeah.
When I got to Williamsburg and had this revelation that, sometimes a script will be given to you, but more often than not, you are the script. Your historic facts, that's your script, that's your basis, that's the canvas on which you can deliver a performance. I sat and realized, like, oh, I'm going to be living that every day. I'm going to get on a stage, not know what I'm going to say, not know who's in the audience, where their head's going to be at. Is it going to be hot? Is it going to be cold? Am I going to be inside? Am I going to be in Riverside, California, to a group of audience who have never explored American history in this way? And make no mistake, there is no crueler audience than eighth graders, Charlie. I'm terrified of them. That is a jury that will not be forgiving. So I had to grow incredibly comfortable with that sense of free fall. I often call the work I do the contact sport of performance, where I'm going to take exactly what the audience gives me and I'm going to give that energy back and grow incredibly comfortable with improvisation, speaking on the fly, and having my mind work on several layers. So, doing the work I do in Williamsburg, and if you've never been to Colonial Williamsburg, come. It's a cool place. It's not the place you went to in the fourth grade. It is, but there's layers.
But here's the thing. Even if it is a little bit of the same, you, the person experiencing it, are a different person.
Yes, absolutely. So the closest thing I can compare the theater that's done there, at least the work that I do, is like devised theater, which we talked about in part one. It's getting up and making this unique piece of theater, usually just with yourself on a stage. All of the action, all the drama, all the battles, that takes place somewhere else. And you are telling a story centered around a specific message. One day it might be the United States Constitution. It might be civic law versus common law. My work tends to get pretty heady. It might be on something more innocuous, an object that you then craft a performance around. And then usually at the end of 20 to 30 minutes, you open it up for questions. And at that point, it goes in whatever direction the audience wants. You are a rental car, and they're going to see how fast you can drive. Really, truly. You're going to do it all in a funny hat, too. And so it's made me incredibly efficient at pivoting, being on the fly. I remember I started auditioning again a few years into doing this work, and suddenly I
Mm.
had no anxiety around auditions because I was so accustomed to that flexibility that comes from really listening to what the person watching you is experiencing, paying
Yeah.
attention to that. And it made me very good at creating sort of quadrants of my operating brain, which all performers do.
Yeah.
You know, you sit and you know, okay, here's what I'm saying now. I'm making sure it's arranged properly, the thoughts are concrete. Then you have sort of a secondary that's slightly behind that, that's a stage managing everything. It's
Mm-hmm.
arranging, okay, this set piece is about to come out. This sentence is where you're going to go. Then you have another piece that's sort of the cohesive arc that's registering something you said and said, okay, I'm gonna return back to that.
Yeah.
Um, Somewhere in there is your other part that's thinking about, what day am I having? You know, am I going to
Yeah.
get lunch after this? If I do, am I going to go to Qdoba? Am I going to Qdoba dressed like James Madison? Okay, if I do that, you know, how do I register that? All of those pieces start operating in sync. They start
Yeah.
sitting and saying, okay, how do we all work together to deliver this performance?
Yeah.
You know, your brain comes to operate in a really unique way that I think is unique in a performance capacity, but beneficial in a wider capacity as well.
Yeah. Two things I think really helps that out. One, subject matter expertise. That's the obvious one, right? That just makes such a difference. I'm sure as a new interpreter, as James Madison, this was far more difficult because you have to almost manually rifle through the notes, the text you have read, the reference points that you have, and try and, the index is like ding, ding. All right, pull that one. And now it's much more of a digitized, automatic, like you have James Madison AI in your head, essentially.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting that. Yeah.
And the second thing for everyone out there that I know really, really helps with this is start by being hyper focused on the present and the immediate. And I'm not talking about the usual casual focus that people have, which is where your mind is usually wandering into other places. It is almost a meditative quality when we zoom in and say, I am just like right now, I am only having this conversation with Bryan. Now, there's a little space in my brain because it's trained that I could just immediately unlock it and go, okay, well, also my kids have school off today. So I know that after this, we're going to go over to Target, which will be about a 7.5 minute drive because we're going to do some clothing shopping. And I can like run that track as well while I'm having this conversation with Bryan, but I couldn't do that before. The whole thing, and this is really what high school theater gave to a great degree. And, it helps that our teacher was Russ Staggs, who we could sing the praises of for a long time.
We should get him for part 3. That would be great.
Wouldn't
that be fun?
I wonder if he would do that.
Do you think he would hop on?
I have his number. I'll reach out.
Let's reach out and see.
Yeah. So we had it drilled into us, just be in the moment. Now, as a performer, you do have to learn how to be in the moment while also understanding the arc of what is happening. This is critical. Now, I keep saying the word now because it's like we're breaking down all these little segments into this. Take it one layer deeper, which is I'm hyper in the moment. I know the total arc of the story. And now I've also done my homework before this moment to know what the objective is here. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because it makes me think of one, the obvious corollary is in the courtroom. I am persuading a jury for an outcome, or I'm persuading the judge for an outcome on behalf of my client. But when you are in the room to make a sale with someone, I find a lot of people, and they go through phases on this. They may walk into the room wanting to make the sale, but there is little thought of the total arc required to get to that sale. What is, if I zoomed out and I were a third party listening in on this conversation that's happening in the consultation room, what would be the story that I could see evolve here? What would be the journey that these two, three, four characters are going through? And, in live theater, one of the best things I ever heard was Mr. J. I think it was Mr. J talking about this. Who, if you listen to the last podcast, he did Shakespeare in the Grove, which we participated in. The most dynamic scenes are two characters who have different objectives that collide with each other.
Mm.
When you are an attorney and you have a person who is going to potentially hire you, you each have slightly different objectives that are colliding with each other. And the question is, where's the scene going to go from there? And the stronger personality and performer will ultimately come out on top. Like that's, if you look at, so I just watched the movie Snow White last night. I took my kids to go see Snow White, and I could barely tell you a thing about the prince character in it, because his attempt to achieve objectives, it just was womp womp. Whereas Rachel Zegler, I don't care what people's opinions are about her playing Snow White, whatever. She held the screen and seemed to really go for her objectives. And for me, that's a powerful idea when I am in the room with a person, which is ultimately I'm running the story here. And I know the arc that we're trying to craft on this. Long and rambly thought process there. Help me out, Brian. Picked up that
well,
thread.
And that gets into one of the fundamental things that I don't know if we've talked about in that, which is actor objective, which is one of the core tenets. Now, people who are unfamiliar with theater, you might call it motivation. You know, that cliche. Well, what's my motivation? But if anytime you were on stage, really, I mean, if we get into it outside of theater and into psychology, everything we are doing in a given moment can be boiled down to what is our objective? What are we actively pursuing? In the midst of objective, there are tactics you use to get that objective. If one objective is met, or if one tactic comes up against opposition or conflict, which makes for good scene work, right?
Yeah.
You then change your tactic, but you keep that same objective. There is objective, and there is the larger super objective, which is what is your through line through the entire show? What is the fundamental thing that will self-actualize the person you are? So super objective might be scaling your law firm, but it might even be bigger than that. It might be the achieving of the life that you want, the difference that you want to make.
Yeah.
And then from there, all the objectives that you chase along the way tie into that super objective. The tactics that you adopt to address conflict or resistance, they change based on that objective. So when we talk about objective or the pursuit of objective in scenes, it is ultimately what a character wants. And any good scene, you know, I encourage any listener, find your show on Netflix and ask yourself in the midst of a scene, well, what do they want in that scene? And if they want this in this scene and they want this in this scene, what's the biggest thing they're chasing? So see if you can catch that little thing and catch when you find yourself disengaged with a performer and wonder why. You know, what are they going after?
You know, that actually makes me think of the difference between television and movies, which I know television is far more popular these days overall than movies. But a lot of people have complaints about certain episodes of their favorite television shows. Like that was an episode, like the number one complaint that seems to happen about most television show episodes is it doesn't seem like anything happened, right? Because they're stretching for time. You remember this, those of you who are listening, I'm doing the like pulling something apart, like I'm pulling apart a piece of dough gesture, or pulling apart some Play-Doh or some string cheese gesture, just stretch for time. And it feels like sometimes that is what is happening. I've seen people who are in the sales process essentially stretch for time because they're so afraid of making a bold move toward the objective or the super objective. And they want to keep playing things out because there's a sense of safety in that. Just, you know what? I'm just going to keep the conversation going because I'm really afraid to ask them to commit to the next step.
I'm thinking also about what you said, Charlie, about the performer who comes out on top is the one who is leaning stronger on their objectives. You know, I was thinking about, you know, what you were saying about sales calls, of how many times in the course of your life have you pacified your objective at the expense of preserving the person across from you. Well, I don't want to inconvenience them. I don't want to take up their time. My ask
Mm-hmm.
is going to be too big, so there's no way they're going to go after it. I don't want to send another email because I don't want to flood their inbox. Focus on your objective.
Yeah.
Lean into your objective, because inevitably your scene partner, the person getting your emails, the person on the other side of the call, the new lead, their objective is going to come through if you never chase after your objective.
And for most people, assume the objective of the majority of your audience is to maintain the status quo. That has to be a baseline assumption that you make, which even in a lot of in live theater, movies, television, any performance, there are characters who are in conflict with the lead character, who often has a dynamic story, and there are characters within the production who have a static story. And if they were realized as a real human being, their objective would be, I want to keep things as they are, because that represents safety. It represents convenience. So let's stay exactly where we are. People who look, the good news is that if you get someone on the phone with your law firm, you have to remember this. They have subtly shifted their objective. And by the way, even more importantly, they have an objective, whether they could consciously express it or not. They may not say outright, I want to hire an attorney. At that point, it may be, I want to know what my options are. But it has broken from, I just want to maintain the status quo. You have to capitalize on that. The moment that there is an opening, like if you're a performer and you're doing improv, say, this is like yes and, which for those of you who don't know, the first rule that is taught in improv is yes and. It is you don't want to face palm another performer and completely switch the scene. Just roll with it. When someone calls you up, you need to yes and that person. It is easy for experts over time to default to no, to default to a preventative state, to that's wrong. I understand within the law, there are things that are actually wrong. But the more you can assume a yes and invite people in, the better. The yes and process for you, Bryan, when you are performing, whether it is a scripted or a more of a traditional improv performance, or you do the ultimate improv as James Madison, how does that play into your work?
That's a great question. I think sometimes those offers that come from audience members, they can involve factually incorrect information. They can involve presumptions that aren't quite the reality of it. And how do you sit in that moment and say, no, you're wrong, that's not how it happened? You're the authority. You're the person in funny clothes. You have greater credibility. You have a microphone. You hold the power in that scene. But what you are faced with in that instance is disconnecting someone from everything else you have to say because you've invalidated their experience. And so the goal in those performances is not, what I want when I go into a presentation. I don't want to teach them my history. That's an after effect if I do the work well.
Right.
What I want is for them to lean in. What I want is for them to feel comfortable, because if they're not comfortable, they're not going to learn. If they're not comfortable, they're not going to change their mind. If they're not comfortable, they're not going to sign on with you as a client. They're not going to buy from you. They're certainly not going to open themselves to trust you. And so how I meet with it, I did it the other day. This is a specific example, but it just happened. And so it's fresh in my mind. I was talking with someone, and it turned out he was writing a history book. And he was like, "Oh, I have some hard opinions about you because of what you said in Federalist 54." He said this to me on the street. I was sitting on a bench. I was having a lovely time. I was reading Immanuel Kant, and I was like, "What did I say in Federalist 54?" And of course, I've read it. It's backlogged in there somewhere, but I didn't remember it in that specific moment. I was like, "Oh, can you Tell me more. And he was.
Oh, by the way, let me just go ahead and put like a highlighter mark on the phrase "tell me more."
Yeah. Yeah. And he was going in, and it was very clear that he had arrived on a very specific platform of this is a core foundational belief of what I have come to understand from my examination of it. Now I could sit in that moment and say, "Oh, you're getting that wrong. You're coming from the wrong place. You've made a mispresumption." And instead, I said, "No, you're right. It does go into detail on that." And it was specifically talking about the 3/5 compromise in the federal constitution. This had to do with slavery and how enslaved peoples factored into the population. Which factored into representation in the House of Representatives. That's your 2-minute history lesson. And
that was like 12 seconds, but yeah.
I said 2 minutes worth of content in 12 seconds. I'm really good at my job. I said, "Oh, you're right. It does go into detail on that." Instead, what I used and said, "Well, you're citing the Federalist Papers. Something to keep in mind with that is it's a work of propaganda. It's explicit. There's a separation between what the writer is saying and what they at their core believe, and what their writer is saying in the larger scale of what the objective is, which is trying to get the federal constitution ratified." Equally, I said, I would encourage you to lean in a little bit more and keep looking. It's very clear you love studying history, so much so you're writing books about it. Here are some things that I've found, some sources that are actually really helpful, that give a greater understanding of what this person's opinions are, what this particular topic is. I empowered them to engage based on what their experience was, honored their experience, and said, keep going. Here are some other tidbits. Here are some offers that I can give you. Here's my yes and to what you're saying. I'm not going to change their mind by saying you're wrong. It's actually this. I'm not going to meet it with force. I'm going to Aikido it. I'm going to sit and hit it and redirect. I do the same thing with, sometimes I'll call on a kid and ask them to give me a specific answer, right? Do you know what this means? Do you know what this is?
Yeah.
That offer sometimes, more often than not, will get met with silence. And rather than criticize or put them on the spot, I celebrate the silence. I say that's a powerful talent, being able to be still and being able to be quiet. There are so many people in my time who I know can't do that. They have to fill a space with answers, but in silence, you keep your power. So you sit and you find a way to celebrate any offer that's given you. Any offer is a win. So how do you take an offer that's given to you, even if it goes against your objective, and say, yes, here's how I'm going to pivot it to continue to pursue my end?
One thing I really like in there, to, again, pull out that mental highlighter and press down on the page, is you offering additional resources. This, when you are performing in any way, shape, or form, but especially if we're talking about a professional, like a lawyer or someone speaking from the stage or whatever it might be, when you have a level of antagonism, perhaps, or even a degree of curiosity that seems to be bordering on a person having an agenda, where you can sniff that out. Or perhaps you just want to have persuasive communication overall and get an audience or an individual on your side early on, rather than focusing on me. I am telling you, this is the way that it is. Can you bring in reference material? Can you bring in case studies? Can you bring in the resources that you use to study up on whatever it is? Can you bring in experiences of others? If you're a lawyer, can you reference other lawyers who have worked on similar matters and their approach and how it matches up towards yours? Can you make it less just about you? And this is where being that subject matter expert and embracing the next step of that multi-track mind, which is being able to shuffle through your mental Rolodex and pull out individual note cards and go, great, this relates over here. Let me go ahead and tuck that into the conversation when I have a good opportunity. Your ability to have that catalog is a superpower. It requires, this is the great gift, I think, of you live, Bryan, as James Madison for, hours at a time, right? You do these spurts of hours at a time. It is constant reinforcement of referencing the material. And I find many people will learn something, but don't consciously take the opportunity to reference that material as soon as possible. I mean, the best thing to lock in something that you've learned is to teach it to someone else. So if you have a book that's, say, been really influential and you're trying to, like, I'll reference when I'm talking about time management with people, I can just holler at them about time management, but I tend to bring Dan Martell's Buy Back Your Time into the conversation, right? That ends up being a framework that we can rely on. The same way that you were able to offer up, hey, here's some other texts that you can go to. And also a fantastic redirect. So there's not animosity directed at, Bryan, the performer that is behind the mask as well. And this is not the easiest thing to do, but if you start by training yourself on be entirely present and actually listen to the other individual and listen to yourself. What are you saying? And if you are having a hard time hearing yourself and what you're saying, honestly, the other person is tuning out. If you are not there with them, they are not there with you. They will respect you with the exact same energy that you are giving to them. Over time, you can then develop a better version of great, I'm entirely focused on Bryan right now, but I am thinking about what have we talked about previously? Are there any open loops that we need to close? Are there any threads that we need to finish pulling on? Even looking ahead towards what's a good way to sort of circle back on something and use it to close out an episode. All of those things come with practice, but the first thing you need is being incredibly present, which can be a little scary as well. So let me empower everyone with another tool that actually relates to something that you recently said, adding, another closing of a loop. Silence. When you are in a presentation capacity, whether it is jury, individual sales, on the stage, seminar, webinar, intake, whatever it is, there is no law binding you to saying the next word immediately after someone has finished their sentence. If you need a moment to collect your thoughts, you will not get in trouble. There is no punishment for pausing, thinking about what do I want to say next here? And maybe even reflecting best of all on, am I headed towards my objective? And do I believe the next thing I'm going to say puts me back on the path toward my objective? If you can take that bit of grace in that moment, that's okay. Look, everyone's used to seeing like improv performers be incredibly on their feet. They're very funny. They're very witty. Not often talked about is the dramatic side of improv performance, which often involves a lot of silence because you have people trying to absorb the circumstances that they're placing themselves in through the improv performance. Silence is your friend here. It's okay. Pause. Organize your thoughts and move forward. As a benefit, you'll probably look really wise in the process. That's what I've found is, give them that thoughtful, like, I'm kind of squinting my eyes a little bit. I'm looking at you. And then I'm going to be ready to move on with this line of questioning.
I'm really excited to add the captions to this episode and put wise pause in that section.
It must say wizened. I want the word wizened. Wizened pause. Is it wizened or wizened? I think it's wizened. It has to be wizened. Wizened sounds too...
Wizened sounds like you've been through too much wisdom. I had a lot of life and got thoroughly wizened. Maybe it is how it's pronounced. Listeners, you can fill us in. It just wizened sounds more austere.
There was actually an attorney who I worked with for some time who he went and took a I think it was an improv class, but I do recall elements of written skit or sketch material as well.
Mm.
But it's a great tool to enhance your processing speed, your mental processing speed. And for a lot of firm owners who are likely learning some of these marketing tactics, sales tactics, presentation tactics, etc., the next question becomes, how do you even ingrain those materials for yourself? And that, again, I'll refer to silence and the deliberate practice of it. Of, am I trying to achieve my objective? Am I using the tool that I most recently consumed? Am I practicing it? And on top of that, so actors, there's a lot of different schools of acting, right? Like we can look at, and there's some similar notions between, say, Meisner, Stanislavski. You can go to Commedia dell'arte, a lot of different performance styles. One really helpful thing as well, a lot of actors will study many performance styles. They tend to focus on, like, this is the one that really works for me, and I'm going to go deep on that. Same is true for you, the listener. When you start finding your performance style, if you see one out in the wild that feels valuable to you, you need to put it into practice and try and go deep with it. And you are going to fail hardly at times. Number of times I have said something, I had something coming out of my mouth where my present brain is completely disassociated from the statement. And all of a sudden my past brain is like 10 seconds behind and starts to pick up on the train of thought that I've been putting out there. And my past brain catches up to my future brain and goes, just so you know, he didn't lay down any track for that train. We are in desperate trouble at this moment. So can you start repairing this issue right now? It happens all the time. But you can consciously do it as you practice it. It's just like everything in life, right? It's practice, practice, practice.
It is. It is. And I think once you find that specification, once you find the way in which you operate best, those other forms take a lot less energy.
Yeah.
The mastery with which you can do many things, because this is your lens, will give you greater clarity. In mastery, you find stillness, you find ease, you find effortlessness. How many times do you, I would say, watch somebody on stage, but also see somebody do anything interpersonally? We're like, whoa, they're trying way too hard. Like, ooh, I see them really struggling,
Yeah.
And then you see a true master at it. I think I'm thinking of dance because I recently went to the ballet.
You're really lording over. That's some cultural lordship right there.
I recently was at the ballet at a museum of fine arts.
Listener, he is saying and behaving in the smarmiest way possible.
I'm trying way too hard. But I'm getting to my point. You can see when something is effortless on someone's face. You can see where they're giving themselves completely to a moment. And we as the spectator say, oh my God, they make it look so easy. When in reality, what you don't see underneath are the years and years of practicing perfectly to get to that place of ease. And when you get to that point, you bring people in, you command attention.
Yeah.
The things that we heard consistently from Russ, which oftentimes are diametrically opposed, are energy and focus.
Mm-hmm.
You need more energy. You need more focus. You need more energy. You need more focus. And you sit feeling like you're juggling. But I think over the course of our 4 years studying under him, you get to that mastery of the two, where suddenly people are paying attention when I'm on stage. The energy feels different when I'm there. I'm zeroed in on the person I'm sharing a stage with at a given moment. And both of us are feeding off of each other's energy. I think about something we were talking about at the beginning of our episode was talking about, mastery of specific things, of being able to do one thing incredibly well because you've examined many things. And I was thinking about a video that I saw of Salvador Dali. He was the famous mustachioed painter.
Yeah.
Persistence of Memory, The Melting Clocks, surrealism. And you see in a lot of the art world these effortless paintings, where you can often sit and say, well, anybody can do that. Anybody can smatter paint on a canvas. The video is of Salvador Dali taking a piece of aluminum foil and in seconds molding it with his thumbs and then turning it over, and it is a human face, like a classical sculpture.
What?
Like it looked like it could have been pressed on a
Whoa.
marble statue, and he just did it with his fingers.
Whoa.
And I think the mastery of artistry is doing all of these forms. You look at some of the impressionists, or you look at abstract artists, and they can do all of those things incredibly well. And because they do all of those things so incredibly well, they've arrived at the thing that says, "This is me."
Yeah.
And I think that's the mastery of law firm entrepreneurship, is your practice so incredibly well. You went to law school to learn the mastery of the trade.
Mm-hmm.
The next level is knowing yourself so well that you can say, this is my product and I am the only one who can do it.
Mm-hmm. God, it reminds me of the probably apocryphal story about Picasso, where he's sitting in a diner and, he's just sketching something, and someone asks, how much can I buy that for? And usually it's some random price, the $1,000, $10,000, whatever. Person says, well, it's just, you were going to leave this behind anyways. Well, you're buying the years of all the practice that went into making this a Picasso, right? It's that idea, that same concept there, but that little bit of mastery. That's why you do have to be a subject matter expert. Well, actually, as a final comparison here, the ultimate comparison being the way that we talk about marketing, which is, it would be very nice if we lived in a world in which all you had to do was be the best craftsperson of whatever it is that you love doing. And naturally, clients, cases, customers, patients, donors, whatever it is that you're looking for would show up at your doorstep. But you have to learn this other skill. You have to learn marketing. You have to learn the act of advertisement, of promotion. Same is true when it comes to delivery of the information. It would be great to just be a subject matter expert. However, we have all encountered teachers out in the wild who we go, I get it. This person is smart. I can't learn a thing from them. There's no hope in this. And I would hearken back to the last episode we did, where that person may be a very selfish individual who they hold their intellect very close to themselves and mostly think about, this is what I'm thinking about right now, as opposed to considering on that other track of your mind, what is my audience hearing? And am I actually helping them to get what they want? When you are performing for the person in the room, when you are doing the consultation, if you are a real subject matter expert, you need to just let that exist as truth and invest in, how do I help the person across the table from me? How do I have this performer's mentality to keep the energy, to keep the focus? Because you may be bored with your subject matter, just like a performer may be doing the show for the 100th time, but it's to a new audience. And that audience paid for their tickets. And they're there to see you, and they want to see that magical experience, because for them, it is one of one. Well, for you, it may be one of 1,000. But your responsibility is to show up as if it is one of one. Not an easy thing to do. Bryan, before we sign off on this episode, I asked you last episode about reading, watching, listening to on James Madison. Now let's let the actual human being, Bryan Austin, speak. Bryan, what are you reading, watching, listening to these days?
Thank you so much for asking. I have been sitting and I was like, I know the titles. Let me make sure I have the authors. And I promptly started this episode and was like, I don't. So I'm just going to do the titles. So I'm reading a book that Tim Simmelroth recommended when he was most recently on this episode, which is Building Your Second Brain by Tiago Forte.
Very nice.
Which is a great read. I've really, really enjoyed it. It's a wonderful mingling of talking about how we have learned and kept information over time, and some really wonderful practical insights about how to, in this age of sort of cloud sharing, get everything that's in our head out onto any page and bring it out at a moment's notice when you need it. So I really, really enjoy that. I'm reading a book called Ingenuity, which is a scientific biography of Benjamin Franklin, which is wild. We have a folkloric view of Franklin, but you study this guy's life and it's so delightful and oddly empowering. The guy retires at 40 from a really wonderful business that he operates, and then goes on to fundamentally shift how we view the world. So it's a great biography. And then for fun, I'm reading a book called Horror Store. And there's a little umlaut on the O, because it is a folk horror exploration of an IKEA store, of what happens when store employees hear a bump in the night and spend an evening in an IKEA-like store. They can't call it IKEA because of copyright. And it is wild, because the book itself looks like IKEA instructions, and in the midst of these chapters has IKEA-like products that ominously describe how it can fit in your home.
Perfect.
A really fun read.
I love it. All right. Well, very good. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Oh, me too.
Bryan.
This is great.
What I would like to incorporate next time for everyone listening out there is we're going to incorporate the larger ideas of production, like sound, lighting, staging, the value of choreography, which is something that early on in this episode, the word choreography very much jumped into my mind. You end up talking about a dance as well, how choreography benefits people. Because you were talking about shows where you learn your lines, learn your blocking, executing it, etc., versus improv, which is free flow, loose form, etc. So we'll talk more about the larger scale of production and how to treat moments in your practice, whether it is intake or what someone experiences in your office, or how you celebrate a win, how you take your team out to lunch and bring a sense of deliberate production into what you do. I think it's going to be really fun. Celebrate some of the behind the scenes work that goes on in theater, live theater as well. So, Bryan, I'll talk to you in the next episode.
Of They Don't Teach This in Law School? There's our cliffhanger.
Oh, that's right. Oh, no. Someone just walked in with a knife.
No, Charlie, no.